For decades, Augustus Wycliffe told visitors that the great hedge maze at Blackmere proved a simple truth. Even nature could be forced into obedience. He never mentioned the elderly black gardener who had shaped every corridor with scarred hands, memorized every hidden turn, and buried one private grief beneath its roots. By 1832, Jonas Demba was too old to frighten anyone. That was why no one noticed the garden changing around them. Blackmere Sugar Estate stood on the western side of Barbados. There, wealth was measured in land, sugar, imported stone, and the number of things a man could force into order. Augustus Wycliffe understood that language well. At 57, he had spent years turning Blackmere into a public performance of control. The main house sat above the cane fields on a raised ridge. It was broad enough to catch the sea wind and high enough to keep the laboring quarters out of sight from the principal terrace. White stone steps climbed toward shaded galleries. Imported furniture filled rooms rarely used except when guests arrived. Even the gardens had been designed to announce status before anyone entered the house. The centerpiece was the maze. It stretched behind the eastern lawn. Walls of clipped green rose taller than a man. Flowering shrubs marked selected corners. Stone urns stood at intersections where Augustus wanted visitors to stop and admire the view. From the upper balcony, the maze looked disciplined and geometric, a living ornament carved into the estate. Augustus liked to stand above it with a drink in his hand and explain what it represented. Order, patience, civilization, those were his words. They concealed the more important fact. He had not built it. Jonas Demba had. By 1832, Jonas was 68 years old. His shoulders had narrowed with age. His back bent slightly forward when he walked. The joints of his hands had thickened after decades of cutting, planting, lifting, and repairing. He moved more slowly than the younger laborers at Blackmere. No one could work the maze as precisely as he could. That was why Augustus kept him there. Not out of respect, out of usefulness. Jonas knew which hedge would split after heavy rain. He knew which roots would undermine a stone border. He knew which plants could survive salt carried inland by storms and which would die after one dry season. He knew where the ground dipped beneath the western corridors and where water collected. He knew where the old drainage lines had been buried and which pathways changed temperature after sunset. He carried the entire garden in his memory. Augustus carried none of it. That distinction had never mattered to the owner because ownership, in his mind, made knowledge unnecessary. When wealthy visitors came to Blackmere, Augustus guided them through the maze himself. Jonas usually remained somewhere nearby. He trimmed. He swept fallen leaves. He repaired damaged branches after guests pushed through the hedges rather than admit they had taken a wrong turn. He was close enough to hear Augustus explain the design, close enough to hear him take credit for choices Jonas had made decades earlier. One afternoon, a visiting merchant stopped beneath a flowering arch and looked back toward the main house. "This is yours?" Augustus smiled. "All of it." The merchant gestured toward the maze. "You designed it?" "I did." Jonas stood less than 20 feet away with a pair of long-handled shears. He did not look up. He cut one branch, then another. There was no protest because protest would have changed nothing. Augustus had built a life around taking possession of other people's labor and calling the result his own. The maze was simply the most visible example. But Jonas had stopped caring about recognition years earlier. His attention was elsewhere, beyond the polished walking routes and decorative arches, past the sections prepared for visitors. The western end of the maze looked different. The hedges grew thicker there. The paths were narrower. Several old stone markers had disappeared beneath roots and moss. The ground remained soft longer after rain. Few guests entered that area because Augustus discouraged it. He claimed the western corridors had never been completed properly. That was a lie. They had once been among the most carefully maintained passages in the garden. Then something happened there. Afterward, Augustus stopped bringing visitors west. Jonas never did. He continued to work that section personally, every season, every year. The other gardeners understood that the western maze belonged to the old man. In a way, nothing else at Blackmere did. Not legally. Nothing belonged to Jonas legally. But everyone noticed the pattern. If a hedge split there, Jonas repaired it. If a storm dropped branches across the path, Jonas removed them. If someone else was ordered to work the western corridors, Jonas usually found a reason to take over. Nobody challenged him. There seemed no reason to. To most of Blackmere, Jonas was an elderly gardener protecting an old routine. To Merrick Shaw, the overseer, routines were worth watching. Shaw was 46. He had spent enough time enforcing Augustus Wycliffe's authority to recognize when silence carried intention. He had never trusted Jonas, not because the old man had openly resisted him. Because Jonas rarely reacted. Threats produced obedience, but almost never visible fear. Insults produced silence. Orders were completed without the performance of submission Shaw expected. That made the gardener difficult to read. One evening, after the visitors had returned to the house, Shaw crossed the lawn and noticed Jonas standing at the entrance to the western maze. He was not working. The shears hung loosely from one hand. Jonas was looking into the corridor. Shaw approached. The old man did not turn. "What are you doing here?" Jonas said nothing. Shaw stepped closer. The path ahead was unusually dense. Branches had grown across part of the entrance. Beyond them, the corridor bent sharply and vanished. "You keep coming back to this side." Jonas finally looked at him. His expression was not hostile. That made the answer worse. "Something you left behind." Shaw's face changed. Only slightly, but Jonas saw it. For a moment, the overseer did not ask another question. The western maze had a history that almost no one at Blackmere discussed anymore. Most of the people who remembered it had learned not to mention it around Augustus. Shaw remembered. So did Jonas. The difference was that Shaw had believed time would make the memory harmless. Jonas had never made that mistake. Shaw recovered quickly. "If there's rubbish in there, clear it." Jonas lowered his eyes. "Yes." Shaw remained for another moment, watching him. Then he walked back toward the house. Jonas waited until the sound of his boots disappeared. Only then did he enter the western corridor. He moved slowly, but without hesitation. The route divided twice. Jonas did not pause. He passed a stone urn half swallowed by roots and turned beside a narrow wall of thorned growth. He stopped where the hedge thickened around an old section of buried masonry. He knelt. The movement caused pain. It showed in the way he shifted his weight. He made no sound. He pushed aside wet leaves. Then soil. His fingers reached beneath a shallow root. Something metallic caught the last light of evening. A small piece of brass, green with age. Jonas held it between his fingers for several seconds. Years earlier, it had belonged to his wife, Amara. Blackmere claimed Amara had run away. Augustus had repeated the story until it became the accepted version. No search worth remembering had followed. No question had been allowed to remain open. A woman had disappeared, and the estate had decided absence was explanation enough. Jonas knew better. He knew where she had gone. He knew who had followed her. And he knew why one of the western exits had been closed before she could reach it. That knowledge had survived longer than the men responsible expected. Jonas returned the brass beneath the root. He covered it carefully, then he stood. Around him, the maze was quiet. For Augustus, silence in the garden meant discipline. For Jonas, it meant something else. It meant nothing had been forgotten. Jonas did not begin changing the maze all at once. That would have been noticed. Blackmere survived by noticing sudden changes and ignoring slow ones. So Jonas worked through seasons. A hedge was allowed to grow slightly wider before trimming. A turn was narrowed by a few inches. A decorative opening that once revealed the house was gradually closed. A stone marker was moved after heavy rain and never returned to its exact place. Each change was small enough to look accidental. Together they altered how the western maze behaved. Augustus never saw the pattern. He saw appearance. That was the difference. From the balcony, the maze remained impressive. Its outer walls were sharp. The central paths were clean. The flowering sections visible from the house were maintained with extreme care. That was what mattered to him. The parts hidden from view received less attention. Jonas knew how much neglect a wealthy man would call control. He used it. When a section of hedge became too dense, Jonas did not always cut it back to the old line. He cut a new one. When a path widened after storm damage, he sometimes allowed vegetation to reclaim part of it. When two routes offered the same destination, he favored one and let the other become less obvious. Nothing about the work looked dramatic. That was why it endured. The maze changed by inches, then by feet, then by memory. A person who had walked it years earlier could still enter believing the old route existed. That confidence became increasingly unreliable. Jonas tested the changes without announcing what he was doing. He watched visitors. He noticed where they slowed. He noticed where they turned around. He noticed which junctions made them call for assistance. Most laughed when they became confused. They had entered the maze expecting confusion. That expectation protected him. If they took a wrong turn, they blamed the game. If they reached a dead end that had not existed before, they assumed they had remembered badly. If they emerged farther from the house than expected, Augustus treated it as proof that his garden was improving. He never asked who was doing the improving. During one dry season, Augustus complained that the maze had become too easy. Several guests had reached the center faster than he liked. He summoned Jonas to the terrace. The gardener stood below the steps while Augustus looked down over the green walls. "I want them uncertain longer." Jonas said nothing. Augustus pointed toward the northern paths. Too open. Then toward the west. Too predictable. Jonas lifted his eyes. How much more difficult? Augustus smiled. Enough that they remember it. That order gave Jonas what he needed, permission. Not permission for revenge. Permission for complexity. At Blackmere, the distinction mattered less than Augustus imagined. Jonas began focusing on the less visible corridors. He thickened boundaries. He reduced sightlines. He allowed certain tougher growths to dominate neglected edges. Plants that caught at clothing remained where a more decorative gardener might have removed them. Dense leaves accumulated in sections where sound already carried poorly. He did not turn the maze into an obvious weapon. He made it less forgiving. The changes affected anyone who entered without understanding the ground beneath the design. Jonas understood it. Augustus did not. Merrick Shaw noticed the consequences before Augustus did. The overseer used the maze rarely, but he crossed its outer passages when searching for workers or checking the grounds. One afternoon, he entered through a side opening he had used for years. He expected to reach the western lawn in several minutes. Instead, he found himself facing a wall of hedge. Shaw stopped. The route should have continued. He stepped closer. The plants were mature, not recent. That disturbed him. Someone had not blocked the path yesterday. It had been disappearing for years. He turned back and chose another corridor. That one bent toward a section he did not recognize. By the time Shaw emerged, he was angry. He found Jonas trimming an ornamental hedge near the kitchen garden. "You changed the western passage." Jonas kept working. "Which passage?" "You know which one." Jonas lowered the shears. "Storm damaged that section." "When?" Jonas looked toward the maze. "More than once." It was an answer that revealed nothing. Shaw stepped closer. "I walked through there before." Jonas met his eyes. "Before is not now." Shaw disliked the sentence immediately. He could hear defiance in it, but not enough to punish without making himself look foolish. The old gardener had stated a fact, nothing more. Shaw reported the altered route to Augustus that evening. The response was contemptuous. Augustus was entertaining visitors in the library and did not appreciate being interrupted over hedges. "The maze changes," he said. Shaw remained standing. "Not by itself." Augustus looked at him. "That is what gardeners are for." Shaw tried again. "Some of the western paths are not where they used to be." Augustus gave a short laugh. "Then perhaps you are getting old." The remark ended the conversation. It also revealed why Jonas had remained invisible for so long. Augustus believed suspicion moved downward, not up. If something on Blackmere changed, he assumed it changed within boundaries he controlled. If Jonas altered a path, then Jonas had altered it as a gardener. If visitors became lost, then the maze was functioning. If Shaw became uneasy, Shaw was being dramatic. The plantation owner could not imagine that a man he controlled legally might be exercising judgment independently. That blindness was deliberate. It was built into the entire system. Jonas recognized it and continued. Over the next seasons, Augustus became even more enthusiastic about the maze's growing reputation. Guests complained that the western routes were difficult. He enjoyed hearing it. A naval officer from Bridgetown emerged irritated. He'd wandered far longer than expected. Augustus apologized without sincerity. "You cannot defeat it by force." Jonas heard the exchange from nearby. The officer laughed. Augustus did too. Neither noticed Jonas stop cutting for a moment. The sentence had landed differently for him. Force had defined nearly everything at Blackmere. Land was controlled by force. Labor was controlled by force. Movement was controlled by force. Augustus assumed force remained useful because it had worked everywhere else. Inside the maze, Jonas built a space where force solved very little. A man could strike branches, he could push through leaves, he could shout. None of those actions told him where he was. Knowledge did, patience did, memory did. Those belonged to Jonas. Still, he never hurried. He continued maintaining the public sections perfectly. That was essential. A visible decline would have brought scrutiny. Instead, the central garden became more beautiful. The entrances were clipped cleanly. The ornamental flowers became richer. The paths used during formal gatherings were almost flawless. The better those areas looked, the less anyone questioned what existed behind them. Jonas understood another truth Augustus had never learned. Luxury could hide danger as effectively as darkness. One morning, a young grounds worker was sent to cut back an overgrown western turn. Jonas intercepted him before he entered. I'll take it. The worker hesitated. Shaw told me. I know. Jonas took the shears from his hand. There was no argument. By then, the other workers had long understood that Jonas guarded the western maze differently from the rest. They did not know why. They only knew he did not allow careless hands there. Shaw noticed that too. His suspicion deepened. But suspicion without proof had nowhere to go. Jonas did not confront him. No threat, no mistake. He simply continued working. That was what made the situation harder to control. A rebellious act could be punished. A visible conspiracy could be broken. A hedge growing differently each year was harder to accuse. By the time Augustus finally walked the western edge himself, much of the transformation had already become permanent. He paused at several narrow turns. Instead of objecting, he looked pleased. This is better. Jonas stood behind him. Augustus pointed deeper into the maze. Guests should not see the next path before they choose. Jonas waited. Augustus moved forward, studying the walls as though they were his own invention. Then he stopped beside the entrance to the oldest western corridor, the same corridor Shaw had seen Jonas watching, the same corridor Blackmere had stopped discussing years earlier. Augustus looked into it for several seconds. Make that section more difficult. Jonas did not answer immediately. He looked past Augustus into the dense green passage. Then he lowered his eyes. Yes, sir. The rain came hard enough to strip soil from the western paths. By morning, runoff had carved shallow channels beneath the hedges. It exposed roots that had remained buried for years. Jonas was already working when Merrick Shaw entered the damaged section with 2 men from the grounds crew. That changed when something metallic caught against his boot. Shaw stopped. The object was small, darkened by age, half-packed with wet soil. He bent, pulled it free, and rubbed it clean with his thumb. It was a brass clasp. For several seconds, he did not move. Jonas saw the change from 20 feet away. Shaw had recognized it. Years earlier, the clasp had belonged to Amara Demba. She had worn it on a narrow leather strap at her waist, attached to a small pouch she used while working near the kitchen garden. It was not valuable. No one at Blackmere would have bothered stealing it, but Shaw remembered it because he had seen it on the last night Amara was ever seen alive. He closed his fist around the brass. Then he looked at Jonas. The old gardener kept clearing storm debris. Shaw sent the 2 workers away. Jonas heard the order but did not turn. When they were alone, Shaw walked closer. What is this? Jonas continued cutting broken branches from the path. Shaw opened his hand. The clasp lay against his palm. Jonas looked at it once. No surprise, no confusion. That was the answer Shaw had not wanted. You knew it was here. Jonas returned to the hedge. Shaw stepped in front of him. I asked you something. Jonas lowered the shears. It has been here a long time. That was all. Shaw stared at him. The silence between them held a history both men understood and neither had named for years. Blackmere's version of Amara's disappearance had always been convenient. She had run away. That was what Augustus said. That was what Shaw repeated. No one was permitted to ask why a woman approaching 60 would vanish into a storm after dark. She had no provisions and nowhere visible to go. The explanation had never been designed to survive scrutiny. It had only been designed to end conversation. Years earlier, Amara had worked near the service grounds behind the main house. She was known for speaking carefully but not submissively enough for Shaw's preference. The conflict that ended her life began without witnesses willing to intervene. Shaw had confronted her near the rear garden after accusing her of neglecting an assigned task. The accusation was minor. His reaction was not. Amara answered him. She did not shout. She did not threaten him. She simply refused to accept blame for work she had not been assigned. That refusal was enough. Shaw moved toward her. Amara stepped back. Then she ran. The nearest open ground led toward the eastern lawn, where guests were gathering. The western path led toward the maze. She chose the maze. Shaw followed. The timing mattered. That evening, Augustus was hosting men whose approval mattered to him. Merchants, planters, and colonial officials were spread across the terrace and dining rooms. Music was playing near the front gallery. Servants moved through the house carrying food and drink. Augustus had built the evening around appearance. Amara threatened that appearance simply by becoming visible at the wrong moment. Shaw reached the terrace and told Augustus she had fled into the maze. His first concern was not her safety, it was interruption. Keep this away from the house. Shaw wanted men sent in immediately. Augustus refused. Too much movement near the garden would attract questions. Guests were already walking near the eastern entrance. He ordered several outer access points secured until the gathering ended. The instruction was temporary, as though an order became harmless because the man giving it did not intend the consequences to last. Clouds had been building offshore since afternoon. By nightfall, the wind rose. Rain followed. The maze became difficult within minutes. Paths flooded. Loose branches came down. The clipped walls that looked decorative in daylight became solid barriers after dark. Amara remained somewhere inside. Shaw knew that. Augustus knew that. Neither man stopped the gathering. That decision defined what came next. By the time anyone entered the western maze in force, the storm had damaged the paths badly enough to erase clear traces. Branches had collapsed across intersections. Water moved through the lower corridors. Several markers were down. Augustus used the storm as explanation. Perhaps Amara had found another exit. Perhaps she had crossed the outer wall. Perhaps she had escaped. The language shifted immediately from what they knew to what was useful. Jonas did not accept it. He entered the maze himself after daylight. He knew where the low ground would have forced Amara away from floodwater. He knew which corridors she would have recognized. He knew which exits remained possible. He searched west. What he found was not a body. It was worse in another way. It was proof that the official story could not be trusted. Near the old service passage, he found broken vegetation where someone had pushed repeatedly toward the outer wall. He found mud disturbed along the stones. He found the remains of the brass strap Amara had worn, and he found the service exit closed. It was not storm damage, closed. The barrier had been placed there deliberately. Jonas knew that passage. It had existed for years. Gardeners used it to carry tools in and out without disturbing guests. If Amara had reached it that night, she would have expected an exit. Instead, she would have found a sealed boundary. Jonas asked who had ordered it closed. No one answered directly. He did not need them to. He had heard enough fragments afterward. Shaw blaming the weather. Augustus complaining about damage near the western wall. A laborer being ordered to reinforce the blocked passage before visitors returned. The estate was not searching for truth. It was cleaning the scene. Within days, Augustus began repeating that Amara had escaped. The certainty increased each time he said it. That was not evidence. It was authority being used as substitution for evidence. Blackmere accepted the statement. Challenging it carried consequences. Jonas did not challenge it publicly. That restraint was later mistaken for submission. It was not. He understood immediately an accusation without power would accomplish nothing. So, he remembered. He remembered where the exit had been sealed. He remembered where the soil had been disturbed. He remembered the damaged roots. He remembered the last object he found near the western passage. The brass clasp Shaw now held in his palm. Years passed, storms covered it, roots shifted, soil hardened over it. Jonas never removed it permanently. He left it where Blackmere had left Amara's story, buried but not gone. Now the rain had exposed it. Shaw understood the danger immediately, not because the clasp proved every detail, because it proved Jonas had preserved the location. He had not forgotten. He had not accepted the lie. He had spent years tending the exact ground. Shaw and Augustus believed the past had disappeared there. Shaw closed his hand again. Why leave this here? Jonas looked at him. So I would remember where it happened. Shaw's jaw tightened. You should forget. Jonas held his gaze. No. There was no threat in the word. That made it harder to dismiss. Shaw stepped closer. For years he had considered Jonas passive. The old man had never confronted him. Now he saw the error. Jonas had not been passive. He had been patient. Shaw looked around the western corridor differently. The narrowed paths, the thick hedge, the blocked sightlines, the old masonry under roots. For the first time, he stopped seeing separate gardening decisions. He saw continuity. The realization did not give him proof of a plan. It gave him something more dangerous: doubt. He left the maze with the clasp still in his hand. Jonas watched him go. The relationship between them had changed. Until that morning, Shaw had been observing an old gardener. Now he was observing a witness who had spent years shaping the ground around the place. Blackmere had tried hardest to make that place irrelevant, and Jonas knew Shaw had finally understood that. After the storm, Shaw stopped treating Jonas as background. He began watching him, not openly at first. He changed his routes through the estate. They crossed the garden more often. He appeared near the western paths without warning. He questioned other workers about which sections Jonas had maintained. He asked how long certain passages had looked the way they did. The answers gave him nothing useful. Jonas had worked the maze for decades. Every hedge could be explained. Every alteration could be called maintenance. Every narrowed path could be blamed on weather, growth, or Augustus's own instructions. Shaw had suspicion. He did not have proof. That distinction frustrated him. Blackmere was a place where men like Shaw were used to acting before they had proof. But accusing Jonas created another problem. The maze was Augustus Wycliffe's favorite possession. To claim that Jonas had secretly transformed it over years was also to admit that Augustus had failed to notice what was happening inside his own garden. Shaw understood his employer well enough to know how that accusation would be received. He tried once. Augustus was standing on the rear terrace, inspecting preparations for another gathering when Shaw approached. The western maze needs attention. Augustus barely looked at him. It always needs attention. I mean, Jonas. That brought a reaction. Augustus turned. What about him? He has been changing things. Augustus looked toward the garden. Of course he has. I told him to. Not just what you told him. Augustus's expression hardened. Shaw continued carefully. Some passages have been altered over years. He guards that side of the maze. He doesn't like others working there." Augustus waited. Shaw had expected concern. Instead, he received irritation. "You are describing a gardener who knows his work." "I found something after the storm." Augustus's eyes narrowed. Shaw did not produce the brass clasp. He had kept it hidden since the morning he found it. Some instinct told him not to show Augustus yet. "What?" Shaw paused. That hesitation damaged his argument. Augustus saw it immediately. "If you have evidence, bring it. If you have nerves, keep them away from my guests." The conversation ended there. Augustus turned back toward the terrace. Shaw remained standing for several seconds. He now understood that Jonas had another form of protection, not mercy. Vanity. Augustus would resist any explanation that made him look ignorant. Jonas continued working as though none of this had happened. He trimmed the public corridors. He repaired storm damage. He replaced several flowering shrubs near the central court, but the rhythm of his work changed. He no longer avoided Shaw's attention. That was new. Before, Jonas had survived by remaining difficult to notice. Now he allowed himself to be seen. Shaw noticed that too. One morning, Jonas stood for nearly 10 minutes beside the central ornamental bed. He did not work. At its center grew Augustus's favorite specimen, an imported flowering shrub that had become the visual centerpiece of the maze. Augustus had built an entire story around it. He told visitors it was rare. He described how difficult it had been to establish in Barbados. He spoke about its survival as though it reflected his own discipline. Jonas had been the one keeping it alive. That morning he studied it in silence. Then he walked away. 2 days later, Blackmere began preparing for another formal gathering. Servants moved furniture toward the rear terrace. Glassware was unpacked. Paths were swept. Augustus inspected the grounds personally. He wanted the maze immaculate. That was when Jonas acted. He entered the central court carrying his long-handled shears. No one stopped him. He had worked there longer than most people could remember. He stood before Augustus's prized plant. Then he cut through the first major branch. The sound was small. The consequence was not. A grounds worker nearby froze. Jonas cut another branch, then another. By the time Shaw reached the court, half the plant was already down. "What are you doing?" Jonas did not answer. Shaw moved toward him. "Stop!" Jonas made one final cut. The central stem bent. The flowering crown collapsed into the path. Shaw stared at it. This was different from everything Jonas had done before. There was no ambiguity, no slow growth, no storm damage. No explanation involving maintenance. The act was deliberate. Shaw understood immediately that Jonas wanted it seen. He grabbed the shears. Jonas released them without resistance. That unsettled Shaw more than a struggle would have. Augustus arrived minutes later. He crossed the lawn quickly, already angry before he saw the damage. Then he stopped. The plant lay broken across the center of the maze. For several seconds, Augustus said nothing. He looked at Jonas, then at Shaw, then back at the ruined centerpiece. "What happened?" Shaw answered. "He cut it down." Augustus stared at Jonas. "Why?" Jonas remained silent. Augustus stepped closer. "You have tended that plant for 20 years. Jonas looked at him. "Yes." "Then why?" No answer. Augustus's voice lowered. "Have you lost your mind?" Jonas bent and picked up a fallen branch. He placed it beside the path. The gesture enraged Augustus because it looked ordinary, controlled, almost procedural. "I asked you a question." Jonas straightened. Instead of answering, he turned towards the nearest corridor. Then he began walking. Shaw reacted first. "Stop!" Jonas continued. Augustus looked at Shaw. "Where is he going?" Shaw already knew. "The maze." Jonas entered the first passage. Augustus called after him. "Come back." No response. The old gardener turned once and disappeared behind the hedge. Shaw did not follow immediately. That hesitation was important. He had spent days imagining Jonas hiding something in the maze. Now Jonas was openly inviting attention toward it. Shaw understood that difference. "He wants us to go after him." Augustus looked at him. "Of course he does. He knows he cannot get out anywhere else." Shaw shook his head. "That is not what I mean." Augustus had stopped listening. The destroyed plant turned suspicion into a public insult. Guests were expected within hours. The centerpiece of his garden had been cut down by a man whose labor Augustus considered his property. The insult was visible. That mattered more to him than Shaw's warning. Augustus moved toward the entrance. Shaw caught his arm. "Send others." Augustus pulled free. "For an old gardener, he knows every route." "So?" Shaw lowered his voice. "He has been changing them." Augustus's face hardened. Again, Shaw had challenged the one belief Augustus protected most fiercely, that Blackmere belonged to him completely. Augustus stepped into the maze. Shaw followed because allowing him to enter alone would have been worse. They reached the first junction. Jonas was standing 20 yards ahead. He had stopped. He turned toward them. Augustus pointed at him. "Come here." Jonas did not move. "You always said this garden belonged to you." Augustus stared. The sentence was not loud. It did not need to be. "You built your name around it," Jonas continued. "You told every visitor it was yours." Shaw scanned the corridors. The hedges were higher here than they appeared from the lawn. The main house was still visible through the entrance behind them, for the moment. Augustus stepped forward. "Enough." Jonas looked directly at him. "Come claim it." Then he turned and walked deeper into the maze. He could have stopped. He could have sent others. He could have ordered the entrances watched. He could have recognized that the man who knew the maze best had just selected the ground. The confrontation would continue on that chosen turf, but authority had protected Augustus from consequences for too long. He mistook retreat for humiliation. He mistook caution for weakness. And he could not accept a challenge from Jonas in the one place Augustus had spent years claiming as proof of his own control. He followed. Shaw followed him. They passed the second junction, then the third. Jonas remained ahead, never moving quickly enough to appear desperate. That was the first detail Shaw could no longer ignore. The old man was not fleeing. He set the pace. At the next turn, Shaw looked back. The entrance had disappeared. The house was gone from view. Only green walls remained. He stopped. Augustus turned impatiently. "What?" Shaw listened. The sounds from the terrace were already faint. He looked toward the corridor where Jonas had vanished. Then he said what Augustus still refused to understand. "He wanted us in here." Augustus dismissed the warning and kept moving. That decision changed the pursuit. Until then, Shaw had still believed they could reverse course whenever necessary. The entrance was somewhere behind them. The house was close. The maze was familiar enough. Within minutes, those assumptions began to fail. The first corridor looked correct. The second did not. Augustus expected a stone urn at the next junction. It was gone. He turned left anyway. The passage narrowed. The hedges pressed closer together. The light grew noticeably weaker between them. Branches caught at Shaw's coat. Dry growth scraped across his sleeves. The path bent twice before ending against a wall of vegetation. Augustus stopped. That was open. Shaw looked at the hedge. Not recently. The branches were mature. Growth had knitted across the old passage over multiple seasons. Augustus stared at it as if the plants themselves had violated an agreement. Jonas closed this. Shaw said nothing. That was no longer the important question. The important question was when. They turned back. At the previous junction, Augustus chose the opposite direction. This route appeared more familiar. The path widened. A low stone border emerged along one side. For a moment, his confidence returned. "I know where we are." Shaw followed. They passed beneath an arch, then another. Ahead, Jonas crossed the next opening. Augustus saw him. "Stop!" Jonas did not run. He continued at the same measured pace and disappeared behind the hedge. Augustus accelerated. That was exactly what Shaw did not want. "Slow down." Augustus ignored him. They reached the opening where Jonas had crossed. Nothing. Two passages split from it. Augustus chose right. Shaw caught his shoulder. "How do you know?" "Because this turns toward the center." "Does it?" Augustus looked at him. The challenge angered him more than the maze did. "I have walked these paths for 20 years. Shaw released him. "So has he." That ended the argument. Augustus continued right. The route bent away from the center. Neither man recognized that immediately. That was the flaw Jonas had spent years weaving into the garden. It only needed to remain familiar long enough for memory to become dangerous. A completely unknown place creates caution. A partly remembered place creates confidence. Augustus possessed exactly enough knowledge to keep making decisions, and not enough to understand where those decisions were taking him. The path descended slightly. The air became heavier. The ground retained moisture from the previous storm. Their boots slipped in soft soil. Shaw stopped at another junction. "Listen." Augustus looked irritated. "To what?" Shaw raised one hand. No music, no voices, no sound from the terrace. Even the activity around the main house had disappeared. Behind the mass of vegetation, the maze had absorbed distance faster than either man expected. Shaw called out. No answer came from outside. Augustus shouted Jonas's name. The old gardener answered from somewhere ahead. Not with words. A branch moved. That was enough. Augustus followed the sound. Shaw watched him. By then, the structure of what was happening had become obvious. Jonas was showing himself only when they hesitated. He was not trying to disappear. He was maintaining pursuit. Every glimpse pulled Augustus farther. Every silence made him search harder. Shaw began to understand that Jonas had anticipated more than the pathways. He understood Augustus. That was the more dangerous knowledge. The owner could not tolerate being ignored. Jonas had spent decades learning which commands mattered to him, which insults provoked him, and how quickly pride overruled caution. The destroyed plant had not been an act of uncontrolled anger. It had been bait. Shaw stopped walking. Augustus continued several steps before noticing. What now? We go back. Augustus stared at him. We are not leaving him in here. We leave the maze and close every entrance. You are frightened of a 68-year-old gardener. I am frightened of being where he wants us. Augustus took one step toward him. This is my property. Shaw looked around. The statement sounded weaker inside the hedges. You keep saying that. Augustus's face changed. Before he could answer, movement appeared at the far end of the corridor. Jonas. He stood there long enough for both men to see him. Then he turned left. Augustus followed immediately. Shaw cursed under his breath and went after him. The new passage was tighter. Several sections had grown inward, forcing them to turn their shoulders. Thorns caught fabric. Shaw tried to push branches aside and received scratches across his hands, but enough to slow him. Augustus forced forward. His irritation was becoming physical. He struck branches away with a walking stick. The movement did nothing but make noise. The hedge remained. The path remained narrow. The garden would not answer to rank. That was the humiliation Jonas had folded into the maze. Outside the maze, Augustus could issue an order. He could expect movement. Inside it, command had no effect on direction. He could threaten a man. He could not threaten a corridor. He could punish disobedience. He could not punish distance. The system that had protected him everywhere else became useless. He could not make sense of the landscape. They reached a broad intersection. Augustus stopped. A broken stone marker stood at the edge. Shaw saw it first. His breathing changed. Augustus noticed. What? Shaw pointed. A section of the marker had split diagonally near the base. He had seen it before, not years earlier, minutes earlier. We passed this. Augustus looked at the stone. No. We did. You are mistaken. Shaw walked to the marker and touched the break. Wet mud still covered the side where his boot had struck it during the first passage. He showed Augustus. We have been here. Augustus said nothing. The evidence was immediate. They were circling, not randomly. Jonas had brought them through a route that folded back onto itself without feeling repetitive. Augustus turned slowly, examining the openings. 4 directions. All of them looked plausible. For the first time, he did not choose. Shaw watched the uncertainty settle in. It was a small change, but it mattered. Augustus had entered the maze angry. Now he was calculating. Fear had not fully arrived, but confidence had fractured. A noise came from behind them. Both men turned. Jonas stood at the opposite end of the corridor, not ahead, behind. Shaw stared. That was impossible if Jonas had remained on the route they were following, unless he had used another passage, a passage neither of them had seen. Augustus raised the walking stick. How did you get there? Jonas said nothing. He stepped backward and disappeared. Shaw moved to the place where he had been standing. There was no obvious opening, only hedge. He pushed branches aside. Nothing wide enough for a normal passage. Then he noticed the ground. A narrow depression ran behind the outer growth. Not a guest route, a maintenance cut. Old, hidden from direct view. Jonas had been moving through spaces that Augustus did not know existed. That discovery changed Shaw's whole idea of the maze. It was not merely a collection of altered public paths. There were layers, routes made for visitors, routes made for workers, routes that had been abandoned, routes Jonas alone still maintained. Augustus had spent years walking only the version of the maze designed for him. Jonas knew the rest. Shaw stepped back. He can move around us. Augustus looked toward the hedge, then find the opening. Shaw did not move. You still don't understand. Augustus turned sharply. Understand what? Shaw pointed to the hidden depression. This place was never yours in the way you thought it was. Those words hit harder than any accusation about Jonas. Augustus seized Shaw by the coat. Careful! Shaw pushed his hand away. The hierarchy between them was beginning to strain. Fear does that. It exposes which loyalties exist only while power appears stable. For years, Shaw had enforced Augustus's authority because Augustus controlled the estate. Now, trapped inside the one place Augustus claimed to understand, Shaw began questioning his judgment openly. The maze was changing more than direction. It was changing the relationship between the men inside it. They moved again. This time Shaw chose the route. He marked each junction mentally. Left, right, straight, another right, then a narrow bend. He counted turns not because he trusted the maze, but because he no longer trusted Augustus. After several minutes, the path opened into another small junction. A second broken stone marker stood there. Shaw stopped. Same diagonal fracture. Same mud stain. They had returned again. Augustus looked at it. No denial this time. He struck the hedge with the walking stick. Jonas! The name carried briefly, then died in the foliage. A voice answered from somewhere they could not see. Calm, close. Still know the garden? Augustus turned toward the sound. Shaw did not. He remained focused on the marker. That was when the final assumption collapsed. They were no longer deciding where to go. They were only reacting to where Jonas allowed himself to be heard. Shaw looked into the corridor where the voice had come from. Then at Augustus. We are not chasing him anymore. Augustus said nothing. Shaw continued. He is taking us somewhere. Augustus did not answer Shaw immediately. The accusation was too close to the truth. He looked down each available corridor, as if one of them might restore the authority he had brought into the maze. Nothing did. The walls were too high and the paths too similar. Jonas had stopped giving them frequent glimpses of where he was. That frightened Shaw more than the pursuit had. As long as Jonas appeared ahead, there was something to follow. Now there was only silence. Augustus finally spoke. There is another way out. Shaw turned toward him. Where? The Western Service Passage. The words changed the air between them. Shaw knew the place. Not in detail, not anymore, but he remembered enough. Years earlier, before Amara disappeared, gardeners had used a narrow service route through the western wall. It allowed tools, cut branches, and soil to be moved without carrying them through the formal entrance. Shaw had not thought about it in years. Augustus had. That fact immediately made him suspicious. You are sure it still exists? Augustus looked at him with irritation. I ordered it built. That was not the answer Shaw asked for. Still, it was the first concrete destination either man had possessed since entering the maze. Augustus began moving. This time he did not wait for Jonas to appear. That was the next shift. Jonas no longer needed to lead them visibly. Augustus was carrying the final route inside his own memory. The western passage lay beyond an older section of the maze, where the ground dipped toward the drainage channels. Augustus believed he could reach it by following the lower paths and keeping the slope on his left. The method was crude, but for several minutes it worked. They moved west. The ornamental features became less frequent. No stone urns, no flowering arches. The hedges grew unevenly, dense near the base and heavy with older branches. This was not the maze Augustus showed visitors. It was the part he had neglected because no guest was supposed to see it. Shaw noticed the irony. The owner knew the decorative roots. badly. Now he was relying on the abandoned ones. They reached a narrow turn. Augustus stopped. There, ahead stood a low section of masonry, almost completely obscured by vegetation. Shaw saw no opening. They pushed closer. The wall was old. Roots had crossed it. Thick growth covered the upper stones. Augustus searched with his hands, forcing branches aside. Nothing. He moved farther along the wall. Still nothing. There was a gate here. Shaw did not answer. Augustus struck the masonry with his palm. It was here. He moved again, increasingly frantic. The wall continued without interruption. Shaw watched him. Then he looked at the ground. The soil was uneven beneath the vegetation. Sections of old stonework extended below the hedge line. This was not a gate hidden by leaves. The passage had been closed. Augustus turned. His face had changed. The anger was still there, but now something else sat under it. Recognition. He shouted into the corridor, "Jonas!" No answer. Augustus called again. This time movement appeared behind them. Jonas stepped into view. He was breathing harder than before. Age had not gone just because he knew the maze, but he remained controlled. Augustus pointed toward the wall. "What did you do?" Jonas looked at the masonry. "Nothing." Augustus moved toward him. "There was an exit here." "Yes." "What happened to it?" Jonas said nothing. Augustus stopped. Memory arrived slowly, not because the event had been unclear, because he had never considered it important enough to preserve. After the storm years earlier, the western section had been damaged badly. Several passages needed repair. Guests had begun asking why one portion of the maze remained closed. Augustus had wanted the matter finished quickly. He had ordered the service gate removed. The gap was filled with stone. The hedge was extended across it. Officially, the reason had been structural damage. That was only part of the truth. The gate was also connected to Amara. Jonas watched the realization form. "You remember now." Augustus looked at him. Shaw remained silent. He remembered too. The night Amara entered the maze, that service passage had been one of the few practical exits from the western corridors. Shaw had known it. So had Augustus. When the pursuit began, Augustus had ordered the outer access points secured until his guests left. The service gate had been among them. Temporary, he had called it. After the storm, leaving the passage intact created a problem. If anyone asked where Amara had gone, the gate raised a question. Had she reached it? Had she found it locked? Had the estate itself prevented her from leaving? Augustus had eliminated the question by eliminating the gate. Stone was easier to control than memory. At least that was what he had believed. Shaw looked at the wall again. "You had this sealed." Augustus snapped toward him. "We repaired storm damage." Shaw did not accept the answer this time. "That is not why." Augustus stepped closer. "Watch yourself." But there was no force behind the warning now. The wall stood beside them as evidence of an order Augustus could no longer reduce to routine maintenance. Jonas walked toward the masonry. He touched one of the older stones. This was open when she came in. Augustus said nothing. Jonas looked at him. "You closed it." The statement was direct. No speech, no appeal. Just responsibility placed where Blackmere had refused to place it years earlier. Augustus tried to recover control. She ran. Jonas did not move. "You locked the way out." She ran from Shaw. Shaw reacted. "Do not put this on me alone." Augustus turned on him. That fracture had been building since they entered the maze. Now it broke open. Shaw pointed toward the sealed passage. "You gave the order." Augustus stared at him. "And you followed it." Neither man denied that. For years, the estate had survived by separating responsibility into pieces small enough for each participant to excuse. One man ordered, another enforced, another stayed silent, another repaired the damage. Then everyone called the outcome unfortunate. Inside the western maze, that arrangement no longer held. The wall connected the decisions. Jonas had brought them to the place where responsibility could not be distributed away. Augustus looked at him again. "You changed the maze to bring us here." Jonas nodded once. At last. Shaw turned toward the path behind them. "How long?" Jonas did not answer. Shaw understood anyway. Years, not days. Not weeks. Every narrowed passage, every altered sightline, every route Augustus had praised because it made the garden more difficult, all of it had preserved one destination. This one. The cruelest part was that Jonas had not needed to invent the dead end. Augustus had built it himself. He had ordered the service exit erased because it threatened the story he wanted Blackmere to remember. Jonas had simply made sure the man who gave that order would one day return to it with nowhere else to go. Augustus struck the wall with his walking stick, once, then again. The sound was dull. Stone did not budge. "Open it." Jonas looked at him. Augustus stepped forward. "You know another way?" "Yes." "Then take us out." Jonas remained still. Shaw watched him carefully. The old gardener's expression contained no satisfaction. That kept the scene from reading like mere rage. Jonas had not spent years preparing for a moment of excitement. He had prepared for recognition. Augustus looked from Jonas to the wall, then back again. "What do you want?" Jonas reached into his coat. Shaw tensed. Jonas removed nothing dangerous, only a small brass clasp, the same one Shaw had found after the rain. At some point, Jonas had taken it back. He placed it on the stone ledge beside the sealed passage. Augustus stared at it. Recognition was immediate. Jonas spoke quietly. "She reached this place too." No one moved. "She knew there was a gate." Augustus looked toward the wall. For the first time, he was not seeing masonry. He was seeing the order behind it. Jonas continued. "She asked for a way out." The sentence stripped away the final defense Augustus had relied on. Amara had not vanished into some unknowable storm. She had been inside a controlled space. Men had known she was there. A usable exit had been closed. And afterward, the estate had chosen concealment over accountability. Jonas looked directly at Augustus. "You had one." The old man glanced toward the sealed passage. "Then you made sure no one could see it again." Augustus did not answer. The silence lasted long enough for Shaw to understand that the argument had ended. There was no version of the past that could survive inside that corridor. The sealed passage was still there, the clasp was still there, and Jonas was still alive. Augustus looked toward the path behind him. "Take us back." Jonas did not move. Augustus repeated the order, louder. "Take us back." For most of Jonas's life at Blackmere, a command from Augustus had carried consequences beyond the words themselves. Refusal could mean punishment, separation, deprivation, or worse. Here, that structure had finally broken. Augustus still possessed the habit of command. He no longer possessed the conditions that made command effective. Jonas looked at him. "That was what she asked you." Augustus's face tightened. Shaw turned away. The sentence had reached its intended target, not his body, his memory. Jonas stepped backward into the corridor. Augustus moved after him. "Do not walk away from me," Jonas continued. Shaw caught Augustus by the shoulder. "Stop!" Augustus pulled free. "He knows the way out." "That is exactly why you should stop." Augustus turned on him. For a moment, the two men stood close enough that the breakdown between them became complete. Shaw was no longer protecting Augustus's authority. He was protecting himself from Augustus's judgment. "You brought us in here," Shaw said. Augustus stared at him. "You followed. I warned you. And I gave you your position." The old hierarchy surfaced for one last time. Shaw almost laughed. "In here, that means nothing." Augustus struck him. The blow was fast and undisciplined. Shaw staggered, then shoved Augustus backward. Neither man gained control. They only lost more of it. Jonas watched from the turn. He did not interfere. That was not what he had prepared for. The maze forced the truth out without any help. Men who had shared responsibility for years tried to separate themselves from it. Consequence had become personal. Augustus recovered first. He pointed toward Jonas. "You did this." Jonas answered quietly. "You did enough." Then he disappeared around the bend. Augustus followed. Shaw hesitated only a second before going after him. The western paths were darker now. Evening had reached the lower corridors. What little light remained above the hedges no longer helped with direction. Augustus began moving faster. That was another mistake. The maze punished haste not through any hidden mechanism. It punished him with uncertainty. Branches caught him. Turns arrived before he expected them. He passed one opening. He doubled back, then chose another. Shaw called for him to slow down. Augustus ignored him. Ahead, Jonas appeared again. He stood at the end of a narrow path. Augustus charged toward him. Jonas stepped through a concealed maintenance opening and vanished. Augustus reached the place seconds later. Nothing obvious remained. He pushed into the hedge. The growth resisted him. Shaw grabbed his coat. "There is no path. There is for him. That does not make it one for us." Augustus turned. Fear showed on his face. Not panic yet. Something colder. He realized another man possessed the knowledge his survival depended on. Augustus had spent decades constructing Black Mirror around the opposite assumption. He believed dependence moved only downward. Now it had reversed. "Jonas!" The name carried into the maze. No answer. "Jonas!" Nothing. Shaw looked toward the sealed western wall somewhere behind them, then toward the darkening passages ahead. "We need to stop moving." Augustus refused. "If we stop, he wins." Shaw stared at him. "That is what you are still thinking about." Augustus said nothing. It was, even now, even after the wall. Even after Amara, even after being led through a garden he falsely claimed to understand. He still saw the confrontation as an issue of ownership. That refusal to understand had always been the deeper problem. Jonas had known it. He also knew the maze better after sunset. He knew it better than either man did in full daylight. He moved through the hidden maintenance routes without hurry. He used the old passages he had preserved for years. He did not return to Augustus. He did not return to Shaw. That choice decided everything. He left them with the place they had insisted belonged to them. Behind him, voices rose. First orders. Then accusations. Then calls for help. The distance between those stages was not long. No one at the main house understood immediately what was happening. Guests had begun arriving. Workers were occupied. The maze had always been expected to contain noise, laughter, shouting, people calling for directions. By the time the difference became obvious, darkness had settled over the garden. Men entered with lamps. They found damaged hedges near the western corridors, a broken walking stick, sections of torn clothing caught on branches. They found Shaw first, exhausted and disoriented near an outer dead end. Augustus was found later farther inside. Neither man emerged as he had entered. Their authority had depended partly on the belief that they understood and controlled Blackmere. By morning, that belief had been damaged beyond repair. Shaw tried to blame Jonas. Augustus tried to avoid discussing the Western Wall. Neither explanation held together. Too many people had seen the destroyed centerpiece. Too many had watched Augustus enter the maze willingly. Too many had heard Shaw warning him, and the sealed passage remained where it had always been. Jonas was gone, not into the fields, not hiding near the quarters. He had left Blackmere by one of the old service routes beyond the garden grounds, carrying almost nothing with him. The shears stayed behind. So did the brass clasp. That mattered. Jonas had spent years preserving both his work and his memory inside the maze. When he left, he took neither symbol. The revenge was complete. Without them, Blackmere did not collapse in a single night. The system around it remained. People were still enslaved there. Sugar still moved from field to mill. Orders were still given. That was part of the brutality of the ending. One man's revenge did not erase the structure that had produced the crime, but something specific had changed. Augustus stopped bringing guests into the western maze. The sealed passage was never reopened. Shaw no longer crossed the garden alone, and the centerpiece Jonas had cut down was not replaced. The empty space remained visible from the terrace. It became the first part of the maze Augustus could no longer explain away. Weeks later, workers clearing fallen growth found Jonas's shears resting beside the old western masonry. The brass clasp lay next to them. No message, no name. Nothing that could be turned into a confession. Only two objects tied to two lives Blackmere had treated as disposable. The garden continued growing. Without Jonas, its clean geometry deteriorated faster than Augustus expected. Corners thickened. Sightlines vanished. Formal paths became uneven. For years he had called the maze proof of his discipline. Only after Jonas was gone did it become obvious whose discipline had actually sustained it. That was the final humiliation. Augustus had owned the land. He had owned the labor under law. He had claimed the design. But ownership had never given him understanding, and when control finally failed, it failed in the exact place he had used to display it. Jonas did not get Amara back. He did not recover the years taken from him. Revenge gave him consequence, not restoration. For one night, the men who had treated another person's life as an inconvenience were forced to depend on his memory. They had to rely on the man they had dismissed. The maze had never been loyal to Augustus. It had only been maintained for him. Those were not the same thing. If you think Jonas's final act was justice rather than revenge, subscribe and tell me this. Did Augustus lose control inside the maze that night, or had he never truly possessed it at all?